As we think about what research has been done in this region looking at how windrow grazing might be used, back in the early part of this decade, in the late 90s, Jerry Valesky and Dick Clark, Jerry's a forage specialist located at the West Central Research and Extension Center located at North Platte, Nebraska, did some windrow grazing on some wet meadow located at the Goodman Sandhills Research Lab with weaned calves, and they found that swath grazing weaned calves on windrow grazed wet meadow was less expensive and would net $10 more per head in their study when compared to feeding those same calves baled hay. There was some other research done by Colorado State University at Akron, Colorado, which is located in the northeast part of Colorado, where they compared the cost and performance of bred heifers grazing swath foxtail millet or being fed baled foxtail millet. Based on their study, swath grazing would save anywhere from 18 to 43 cents per head per day, depending upon how often they moved the fence, and they saw no difference in heifer performance when they compared either feeding the heifers baled, swathed, or baled foxtail millet compared to swathed foxtail millet. Back in 2005 in the Southern Panhandle, we did a windrow grazing demonstration, an on-farm demonstration in Dual County, looking at the potential of swath grazing foxtail millet with weaned calves. The millet was drilled on the 24th of June and swathed on August 24th. We're going to see as we go through this that some production on the east half of this field was poorer due to some poor fertility, and production on the west half was estimated to be around 2 tons per acre. The reason for the difference in the yield on this field was due to the history of some manure being applied on the west half of the field and not on the east half. This is what the windrows look like right after harvest. You can see the windrows there in the field, and you can see the difference in the tonnage on the east end of the field versus the west end. Here's the west end here. You can see much deeper, heavier windrows. Here's the east end. Again, this was cut around the 24th of August. Here's the picture of the field 2 months later, and you can see a clear marked difference between the west end of the field and the east end of the field. Here's the west end of the field here, where it starts, and the east end here. We started windrow grazing some weaned calves on this windrow grazed, or this foxtail millet, on the 31st of August. The weaned heifer calves were weighing right at 489 pounds at that time. We put a couple of cows out with these calves as babysitters for the first couple of weeks so they would get a new herd established, that the cows could kind of provide a nucleus for that new herd so they could find the electric fence, find the water, and begin to see that as home. During that 2-week transition period, the calves also had access to some pasture that was right nearby where they had been weaned. In this case, on this windrow grazing demonstration, the fence was moved every 4 days, and the operator of this operation estimated that we were losing around 15 to 20% of the forage that was windrowed as waste. Here's kind of a layout of how the windrow grazing occurred. In this case, they had a water point located on the west side of the field, and they used a temporary electric fence, moving it to the east, perpendicular to the windrows, giving them some new windrows every 4 days. Here's a picture of the calves grazing those windrows later in this year. You can see off to the south is a wheat field bordered by an electric fence. Here in the foreground is a temporary electric fence. You can see the heifer calves out grazing on those windrows. After the millet was cut, there was a little bit of millet regrowth, and so we see the calves in the foreground here. The fence has just been moved. They're grazing the millet regrowth and going ahead and digging into these millet swaths and grazing on them as well. I think this is a nice picture. This black heifer here has stuck her nose down in the windrow, pulled out a mouthful of feed. You can see it's got a nice green color, even though the top looks weathered. When we turn these windrows under, if we looked at them at the end of September here, you can see the bottom part of the windrow is very green. It has a nice leafy appearance. There was not any appearance of mold, and the calves readily dug through the windrows and really did a nice job in eating the feed. Here's what the quality of the forage of the windrows looked like initially. when we tested it. It was running around 13% crude protein, had a TDN estimate of around 56%, a relative feed value of 84. Well, on the 3rd of November, we weighed these heifer calves again, and they weighed about the same as they did when we put them on, and they had a 65-day grazing period. Those calves really didn't gain very much, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why. But we got over 400 grazing days per acre with these calves on the windrowed millet. Salt mineral was provided, and during the latter half of the windrow grazing, some protein blocks were provided as well, but little consumption of the blocks occurred. So some things we learned. Well, first, the calves did utilize the windrows fairly well. But as we think about the calves that were being used on the windrow grazed millet, we really probably would have liked to seen that millet harvested earlier. It was fairly mature at the time of harvest, almost fully headed, and so the energy available to those calves was not as much as we'd have liked to got the gain we would have liked to have gotten. Another thing we could have done is move the fence more frequently and not force the calves to clean up those windrows as much as was done. And we could have also allowed for more waste and brought some cows in later to clean it up. The other thing that we really would have liked to seen is have those windrows be as heavy as deep as possible to reduce weathering that occurred, especially on the east end where the windrows were more light. This next slides I'm going to show you is from some windrow grazing that was done with pairs. These are some spring calving cows that calve in May and June, but they were grazed with their calves at side late in the year in the November, December, January time frame on some foxtail millet that was grown under a limited irrigation pivot. In this case, the crop was swathed in early September with a 30-foot draper head, and again, as I said a moment ago, late April, May calving cows were grazed on these windrows. Here's a picture of these cows and calves together. You can see this area in the foreground is where they have been grazing. Here's a temporary electric fence. This is a polywire with pigtail posts. Where the cows are, you can see these big calves with them is where the cows have been grazing. In the foreground is the area that is to be grazed yet. Here's a picture just we kicked over a windrow. You can see a picture of the windrow there, again using a 30-foot draper head, around a 4 to 6 inch stubble here. And you can see underneath the windrow very nice green leafy feed, while the top is kind of weathered. The bottom underneath looked good. Here's what a picture of that windrow looked like underneath. Again, green leafy feed and a very nice, not any mold or